Well, thanks, Ken. Always inspiring to hear from you. And I know Ken and the entire Farming Smarter team are always encouraged by the support of their smart partners and our event sponsors like Jasper Homes and Jade Homes. Well, so far we've been down under as we've talked about soil health, but now we're going to go down under literally as we travel to Australia and New Zealand to visit with our next series of speakers. First, we introduce you to Hamish Marr, a Nuffield scholar and a fifth-generation intensive arable farmer from Methven in the South Island of New Zealand. After graduating from university, Hamish spent time with a fertilizer firm as a field officer before embarking on his career in the family operation, which specializes in small seeds on about 500 hectares, and that's where he's raising his young family now. Hamish is involved in several industry organizations like Federated Farmers and the Seed Quality Merchants Association. As well, he's a part of the Foundation for Arable Research. Of course, glyphosate has been a hot topic of late and under attack as a farming tool for both environment and human health areas. Hamish embarked on a study to establish from a farmer's point of view what the issues are around glyphosate use, how it's regulated in New Zealand, and what farmers there could learn from others if a ban or deregistration were to become a reality. We're looking forward to hearing his findings. Here's Hamish.
Well, good day to you all, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. Given the other speakers you have on your conference, I feel humbled to have been invited. Before I begin, I thought I would explain about me and my background and how I got here. I'm a grain and seed farmer from the Canterbury Plains of New Zealand, and you can see by my screenshot there, this is where I live. This is my part of the world. We produce wheat and barley, oats, peas, red clover, mustard, and what you call orchard grass seeds on 500 hectare farm, 450 metres above sea level, with around about a 45-inch rainfall. On top of these crops, we run 500 cattle throughout the year, an additional 1,000 cows through the winter, which we graze mainly on fodder-type cover crops, which we sow after harvest each year. We also have around 3,000 to 4,000 sheep each autumn. The mountains in the background, that's Mount Hutt behind you. There's a ski field over the back there, and that is the Southern Alps, which is a smaller version of your Rocky Mountains, a lot smaller, but very similar. In 2019, I was awarded a Nuffield scholarship to travel the world and looked at agriculture, not just about how we do it on the ground, but also a deep look into the way agriculture fits into the framework of society. At politics, about how people live, how people buy their food, why we grow what we grow, where we grow it, and how all of those things come together. As part of that study, I undertook a look into Roundup under the title, Can We Farm Without Glyphosate? Very quickly, the reason for this topic is that in developed countries such as yours and mine, glyphosate is under increasing pressure towards deregistration. And as a farmer who depends on it, like many, I wanted to understand what the issues are, what can be done about it, and if we could, operate without it. I spent 6 months away from home in 2019, and I visited 13 countries. I looked at organics, at GM, at regen ag, at subsistence farming, corporate farming, horticulture, orchards, vineyards, people who told me they couldn't farm without it, people who told me they could. There were people who were adamant that Roundup is killing us. I visited doctors and hospitals and everything in between. So my findings are based on all of these visits and discussions. It's no way a scientific study, more a view of agriculture from above, through the eyes of a farmer, and hopefully you'll all get something meaningful out of what I'm going to present. Today I want to quickly discuss three things that have a practical impact on how we farm and how we best manage these things. So I want to talk to you about three things. Number one, chemical resistance. Two, integrated weed management. And finally, three, life without glyphosate. So just before we start, I thought I'd give some context about why this is important and how we've got to where we've got to. But we need to understand what agrochemicals, and particularly glyphosate, did for agriculture and why it's important. And again, I apologise in advance if I'm speaking to the converted. The fundamentals of agriculture are very straightforward, and they are the same everywhere. We plant crops in the soil and we harvest them either with machines, with people, or with animals, and we do this year after year. In all crops that we plant, weed control has been and remains a big consideration on how we run our farms. Prior to 1973, when Roundup was first introduced to the market, farmers had two options for weed control: expensive selective herbicides with varying residual problems and cultivation. It was not uncommon for farmers to cultivate soil 6 to 7 times to control weeds prior to planting. A seedbed was the result, almost by accident. This overcultivation of soil has been the primary cause of topsoil erosion around the world. It has been shown in places such as the Midwest that soil losses could be upwards of 3 tonnes per hectare per year. Now, this does not sound like a lot, but when you consider scale, 50 million hectares of cultivated land, 150 million tonnes of topsoil, all containing nutrients, paid for by farmers, and then flowing down the big rivers such as the Mississippi and the Missouri. Soil erosion is only one factor. Time and fuel are the other two. So much time was spent and so much fuel was burnt on weed control, many months in a lot of cases. What Roundup did for agriculture was a complete shift in the way farmers approach weed control and cultivation around the world. There are 3 key factors that make glyphosate the most widely used chemical in history, and also why it is often labelled the chemical of the century. The first one is its mode of action. Glyphosate is a systemic herbicide that disrupts the production of an enzyme found only in plants, meaning that all plants are susceptible to glyphosate within a calibrated rate of application. Its mode of action means the chemical is translocated to the roots and the plant eventually succumbs. The second, it is generally considered in the science community to be low toxicity in mammals, including humans. This has meant that growers could apply measured amounts and not be worried about residues in food. The third and most important point is that glyphosate has a 0 plant back period, meaning we can spray today and drill tomorrow without any fear of damage to the following crop. These 3 factors in combination have enabled some huge advances in agriculture. It has enabled minimum tillage and 0 tillage to become globally accepted best practice, drastically reduce soil erosion, as I said earlier, because now farmers, and think about this for the growers in the room, farmers now cultivate simply to create a seed bed, not to control weeds. In warmer climates, continuous cropping was now possible. In more recent times, cover cropping has become common, and all of this possible because glyphosate has completely changed weed control as we know it. So why are there issues with Roundup? Put simply, and these are my observations, is that Roundup has really become a victim of its own success. I said earlier that it was the chemical of the century because it changed agriculture. In New Zealand, where I live, we have no GM cropping. And prior to visiting Canada and the US, my understanding was at best limited to what I read or what we heard from groups such as Greenpeace. Having spent much time in both countries, my opinion is much different to what Greenpeace told us. The tomatoes would grow legs and walk away. We would have cows with 2 heads and 6 legs. The consumer is being told that glyphosate and GMOs are killing them and the environment. What they aren't told and certainly don't understand is what GM cropping has done for food safety, nor what Roundup has done for food production globally. Now, I've borrowed this next slide from Science magazine because I think it explains very simply where we have got to. The graph shows insecticide applications versus the amount of BT corn sown in the US over time. The graph speaks for itself. I don't need to explain really what this means, except to say the amount of insecticide being applied to corn crops and to BT corn crops now is virtually nil. So when you flow that on, the insecticide we now have in our food is virtually nil by comparison, and that is within a 15-year window. And coming from a country that has no GM, I was blown away. When we look at the next slide, which is corn, the corn herbicide use in the United States between 1990 and 2014, which I've borrowed from the Genetic Literacy Project. It again tells the same story, that the amount of harsh chemistry that we're putting on corn crops in the United States and other GMO countries has dropped dramatically because of GMO technology and the use of the benign, safe, low toxicity glyphosate. And again, coming from a country that had no GMO and only knowing what I'd heard, this was a real wake-up call for me, and something that I wasn't really expecting. Now, this should have been a win-win for farmers and consumers. And looking one-dimensionally at this, you would say it is. However, it is at this point that the good news story takes a little bit of a twist. Now, I was fortunate enough to visit the big chemical companies, Monsanto, Bayer, Corteva, Syngenta, and quite a few of their ex-employees. All of these people told me the same story, that they sold the good news story of GM to the farmers, but they forgot about the consumers. And today it is too late. The success of Roundup as a chemical has led to so much of it being applied, and so often, that we now have a huge global movement working against its use. And in Europe, we're seeing bans on application in some countries, and even here in New Zealand it is under review. Even though as a result of my own study, where I concluded that here in New Zealand, we only apply glyphosate to 6% of our farmland annually, it is still public enemy number one. The public and the politicians see a completely different story to those of us in agriculture. So I'd like to discuss three separate and important considerations with you now. And the first one is resistance. Most of us have heard about resistance to chemicals, and many of the farmers in the audience may have some experience of it. It is a huge problem in some places, and one that is going to be difficult for a lot of farmers to get out of. Chemical resistance comes from repeated use of one product and small populations of plants or weeds surviving that then multiply. There are things farmers can do to minimise the chances of resistance. And I think this graph that I've put up here, which I've borrowed from Rothamsted Research in the UK, demonstrates the core understanding of how we've got to where we've got to. We all know about LD50s for chemicals and the human safety aspect of that, but have we considered the same thing for plants? For those unaware, everything around us is toxic, depending on the amounts of it that we ingest. So everything has been given a fatality rating known as an LD50 number. LD meaning lethal dose, and 50 standing for the amount required to be fatal to 50% of the population. The chart on the left that comes from Rothamsted clearly shows the different rates required within a plant population to control any type of plant or weed. There are some that require very little, and there are some that require a lot more. And it is these plants, and even the ones outside of the graph, that are the ones that will go on to develop resistance. When we understand this and realise it is a very real thing, then we were able to consider resistance management in real terms. The second point is that we must remove volunteers. When we spray a weed with a lower rate than required to kill the individual, or if it sits outside of the graph that we just saw, the progeny of that weed will go on to have an increased chance of sitting on the high side of the graph. And so the cycle of resistance begins. the more applications and the more survival, the greater amount of chemical is required. So we have resistance. The most important thing a farmer can do is remove the volunteers that survived the spraying and remove them and their seed from the field. The photo on the screen that I've shared is of a ryegrass in a field of my wheat. In New Zealand, we're starting to see Roundup resistant ryegrass. In the UK, they have big problems with blackgrass and wild oats, and I certainly know about Palmer amaranth in North America. So we must, as farmers, remove these escapees and stop them from seeding before there is a problem. For anyone using Roundup prior to harvesting, it is also increasing the likelihood of resistance, as the seeds of any of these survivors are sprayed, and this will speed up the pathway to resistance. It is one job we never look forward to, but we do routinely go through with people every year and remove any of these escapees. And it's just one of those jobs that we have to do. The third thing that we must do is we must increase our rotation lengths. A key component in agriculture today is how simple our rotations have become. In simplifying our farming systems, we have simplified our management. And in doing so, we've lessened the time between like chemicals and also limited the amount of alternative chemistry that weeds are being targeted with. One thing that struck me instantly on my travels was that most people, when they are moved away from what we would call traditional agriculture, when they went to regenerative agriculture or to organics, the very first thing they did was to increase the number of crops they grow. In the Midwest with corn and soy, and in Europe where the crop mix in traditional agriculture has been based around autumn sown canola or wheat, increased rotation length potentially looks like the slide that I've just put up. Now this slide comes from INRA, which is a government sponsored research company in France. And the tables look very complicated, but what they represent is one suggested crop rotation for a world with limited access to chemicals. Most of them are based around wheat. The dark brown patches, the dark brown segments in the top two are wheat, but then different crops and different tillage techniques in between. Now, there are very, very real lessons for farmers and agronomists in this table. And that is that if we are a little bit irresponsible and don't heed the warnings about resistance and about potentially losing chemicals, this is the kind of future that we face. And it looks incredibly complicated when you think about the way we farm currently. That to me just looks like something that's very, very, very complicated to manage. So farmers that have resistance have already lost the battle and face something like this in the future. For the rest of us, we need to consider how to responsibly use the tools we have so we don't get to that point. As I said, the organic and regenerative agriculture farmers immediately increase their crop mix because they realise they need to manage their weeds in a different way. The more diverse our crop mix, the more opportunities we have in winning the war on resistance, because we will be using different methods for weed control for different crops. They may well be chemicals, but they will be different chemistry, and there is a much greater chance combination of all of that, and there will be long times in between. The second thing, the next thing is rates. It is widely understood today that we must keep the rates of our herbicide up. We cannot cut corners. We cannot cut corners in application. As soon as we drop rates of herbicide, we increase by factors of 10 the likelihood of resistance. Label rates are there for a reason. We must stick to them. Sometimes we think we're saving money by cutting rates, but actually all we're doing is using time up. So the next thing I would like to talk about is integrated weed management. And as I said earlier, I spend a lot of time with the large chemical companies, and they're all very aware of the problems in the future, the problems with the resistance, and more importantly, the slowing down of new chemistry. Many companies have exhausted the supply of new technology or new chemistry. There simply will not be in the future any new herbicides to any great degree. And that is a real thing that farmers need to understand. The combination of these two things is a real concern for agriculture. However, farmers, I find, are very shy about tackling these issues until they need to, and by then it is often too late. A term that has started to be discussed is integrated weed management. It's a very loose term. Now, I'll just put that up there so you can read that while I'm talking. It's a very loose definition of integrated weed management, and this is my definition, is that we consider everything involved in the management of a field based on the weeds that are present. And it can be demonstrated clearly by this table or this picture, and there's a lot going on in this table. But once I explain it all, I think we should have a better understanding. I borrowed this again from Rothamsted research in the UK. The philosophy of integrated weed management revolves around the 5 dark blue circles in the middle of the screen. And the first one is it's called diverse cropping systems, in brackets, in space and time. And by that it means that we must consider as I said before, what is the best rotation? What is how best should I manage the margins of my field? Should I use cover crops? How best do I plant my fields to make the best use of all of the economies going on in my farm? The second one is to choose a cultivar of seed or a crop mix that again best suits the weeds that are present. What is the best time of year to sow that? Should I sow it early and use a pre-emerge, or should I sow it late and spray first? Should I deep plough? Should I not? How should we sow that? The third one is field and soil management. And again, this comes back to the cultivation. What is the best cultivation method for the particular weeds that I am wanting to target? Am I best to cultivate? Am I best to min-till? Are we best to pre-emerge, post-emerge cultivation? Are we best to inter-row cultivate? All of those things. The next one is targeted control. And it is around what is the best spray program that is going to provide the best outcome for the crop that I'm going to plant. Again, all the spraying, pre-emerge, post-emerge, spot spraying, hand weeding, all of those things are considered in this integrated weed management when we think about it, the targeted control. The fifth one, and this is one that I think is often overlooked, and it's called monitoring and evaluation. And to me, this is where that removing the volunteers comes into it. Go back and have a look. Look at your crops, evaluate what's worked and what hasn't worked. Make a decision and take some notes to say, right, next year, I'm not going to use such and such because it didn't work. We'll try something else. Go and realise that actually the ryegrass has grown through the grass killer that you've put on, or the Palmer amaranth is about to set seed and we need to do something about it. Use the tools. We've got drone technology now. We've got satellite imagery. We've got all of these things coming, and all of them have a place in this integrated weed management. And when I looked at integrated weed management for a start, I was quite daunted. But actually, there's nothing to be frightened of in this, because in actual fact, a lot of farmers and agronomists are doing this already. May not be doing it all, but doing a fair bit of it all. A fair bit of it. What we didn't realise was that it had a name. Oops. I have two examples of integrated weed management that I saw on my travels that I'll never forget. I visited a large property in the UK that had massive problems with resistant blackgrass, huge problems. And they felt like they were losing the war with up to 5 applications of Roundup each year. Out of desperation, and quite by accident, they tried grazing sections of their farm between crops and during the winter with sheep, and quite unbelievably found that they lessened the amount of Roundup that they were using by upwards of 90%. What they found was that the sheep were grazing the germinating weeds and could be used at times such as immediately after harvest, before a lot of the weeds had time to drop their seeds. Now, this is just one example of integrated weed management. And this particular operation have completely changed their crop mix and the intensity of their operation as a result. And as a result of that, the blackgrass problem has really gone away. The other thing they discovered quite by accident was that if they left their wheat fields lie dormant for a little while and grazed them, the black grass that grew up in them did not like the grazing and largely died out. Another example I saw was in California. And I saw this on a number of occasions. I also saw it in carrot seed production in eastern Oregon, where it's very dry. And it was the use of drip irrigation. And I'll put this photo up so that you can see. These organic tomatoes were some of the cleanest crop of any crop I've ever seen. They had no disease. They were beautiful green, lush tomatoes. And yeah, they were amazing. What the farmer was doing here was he was using drip irrigation deep in the soil, not just near the surface, but deep, and utilising the fact that the Central Valley of California is quite dry. And by keeping the soil surface dry, the weed seeds near the surface wouldn't germinate. And so these particular tomatoes have never been cultivated, and they've certainly never been sprayed, and yet there's not a weed to be seen anywhere. It was quite incredible and a real eye-opener for me. And it was the same with the carrots in the Central Valley, in the eastern Oregon, again, a very arid climate. And they found if they kept the leaves and kept the plants dry, that they would virtually have no fungal issues. So I'll put on the side of the slide there, understand your farm and manage your system. You know, if we evaluate the natural capital of all of our farms, they're all different, but there's all little advantages that each and every one of us have that we can use somewhere along the lines. And those two things to me were prime examples of those things. If you think about the tomatoes, controlling weeds in an organic situation is a real challenge. But here was an example of how to do it, just using nature. Just on that, I often think about the farmers who are organic and who are regenerative. And that one of the first 3 principles in regen ag is to include livestock in the mix somewhere. Now, the examples that I have just given don't suit everyone, because, as I said, everywhere is different, and we all have different constraints that govern what we do. But if I could leave you with any advice from today, it is to consider a farm system approach to your cropping system and to your weed control. It is very easy to reach for a can. The reality is that sometime in the future, the can may not be there because it doesn't work anymore. All right, life without Roundup. As I said at the start, Roundup revolutionised agriculture for three key reasons. Because it's broad spectrum, it has low toxicity, and most of all, it has a zero plant back period. There's been much work done by researchers and companies on this topic, and they all talk of lower yield and lower cost. And I mean, and you can see an example here on the slide. This is one that has come from the UK, and I could read through them, but you probably can. It's much the same in most developed countries, that agriculture contributes so much to the GDP of all of our countries that to change the system ends up costing the economy and the industry so much money directly to farmers, but also indirectly to industry, and lower yields, which then flows through to transport, which then flows through to food prices, which is essentially what the slide I've put up there says. There are two things that, in a world without Roundup, there are two things that will affect us as farmers more than anything. The first one is, and if you think about the slide I put up from France with the three circles of the three potential crop rotations, the first one is that things get a lot harder and a lot more complex. We will need to cultivate more. We will need to burn more fuel, and this all takes time. The most important one for me is that the chance of crop failure increases dramatically because Roundup has become, to many, an insurance policy that has kept our farms clean without us having to think about it. And it is that point that makes Roundup such an important chemical to food production. We have to remember that the world trades on purity. Not many people appreciate that. And when I say the world trades on purity, it means that our corn, our soy, in my case, our grass seed, our clover, all of the crops that we grow are traded. They're traded as corn, and they're traded as soy, and they're traded as grass seed. They're not traded as corn and Palmer amaranth or ryegrass and with wheat. They're traded as pure lines. And we will really run into problems with our markets if we cannot control the weeds in our crops. There are many academics who say outright that the world will simply starve without Roundup. One stat that I was often quoted was that if we took Roundup off the market, the fuel burn in the United States alone would be the equivalent of 50 million additional cars on the road per year. So when you sit back and you think about that today, when we talk about climate change, and we talk about carbon, we talk about efficiency, to take Roundup away and then add another 50 million cars because of it, where are we? That's a real question and a real something real to think about. From my perspective, I think there are examples of people who have very successfully farmed without Roundup. And again, as I said earlier, we can learn lessons from those farmers. Innovation and technology will get us a long way down this path in time. There are plenty of farmers today crimping cover crops prior to sowing and not applying herbicide as the cover crop helps shade the soil. Now this photograph is crimping faba beans that have been grown, this is in France, have been grown over the winter time, and they're drilling corn into the beans. The beans haven't been sprayed, they've simply been crimped in front of the drill. The beans fall down, the corn grows up between, but the beans shade out the in between the rows, and very limited weed pressure in between the rows. And that's just some of the innovation that we're seeing, and we see more and more of this all the time. You know, some people think that this is moving away from what we call traditional agriculture, but agriculture is always changing and there is always innovation. Generally, innovation is good. And that innovation is one of the key things. You know, we have to be flexible in our systems if we want to be flexible with weed control. In terms of life without Roundup, I don't think it is possible or sustainable given the population today. But what I do think is that we really have to consider how we use Roundup going forward. In New Zealand, we use very little compared to North America, for example, but we have a movement against it. We need to, as farmers, self-regulate how much we use and where we use it. And we have to consider all of those factors that I've discussed with you in the past half an hour. Farming in itself is very simple. As I said at the start, we plant a seed in the ground and we harvest it later. The part in between is very complicated. And we must use all of the tools available to us to ensure we keep the efficacy of the ones we depend on year in, year out. If we don't learn the lessons on resistance, for example, we'll almost certainly lose those tools in time. That is a real threat. If we do, we will be forced into major adaptive change. Have a look at your farming system. See where it could be changed. See where it could be adapted. Understand your natural capital. Or add another crop for the sake of long-term sustainability. Oops, sorry, pushed the wrong button. I can go to there. As I said at the start, that I had titled my study, "Can We Farm Without Glyphosate?" When I left New Zealand, I was sure we would eventually lose it due to political pressure. However, as a tool, it is one of the most important we have because it gives us the flexibility to be nimble in our approach and adapt to where we see fit. The public don't understand the difference it has made to food production, and it is up to us to explain. It is also up to us to be responsible with its use and don't overdo it for the sake of their health and its continued use. Roundup is almost certainly a victim of its own success, as I said. It is so good and so easy to use that we have overdone it. It is human nature. It is no one's fault. I don't think we need to worry about farming without Roundup in many places, but we need to be open to other ways to do so that we can do things and keep it at the same time. Thank you very much. And this is where I live. The red circle there is approximately where I took the first photo looking up at the mountains there. So thank you very much. And is there any questions?
Welcome back to Zoom, everyone. And as we enjoy this wintry day from the comforts of our own home and office, Hamish, make us feel a little warmer. What's the temperature right there in New Zealand today?
Well, thanks, Diane. I'm not sure that I can make you feel any warmer, to be honest. We've had 100 millimetres of rain in the last 24 hours, which for some people that's 4 inches.